So we're going to be talking about publishing your data. And a question you might ask if you haven't thought about this before is, do people actually publish their data? I think when I was a student myself, and this was quite a long time ago, as you can imagine, there was a bit of back then. This was I won't say it was in the early days of the internet. The internet had been around. It wasn't like it is today, but the idea of actually publishing your data set up online in some form, you'd have to be crazy to do that, right? Because somebody might take your data and publish it before you could. And maybe there were some of my fellow students were working on things. They hadn't published a paper yet. And so the idea of publishing data before you published a paper, well, that was crazy because somebody else could take your data and publish it before you did and scoop you on your own data. The idea of publishing data after you wrote a paper about it was also, not clear because why would you do that? Because you've already published the data. Who would care about your data? Well, if we fast forward, maybe I'll round in the direction of kindness to myself. And if we fast forward 25 years since I was thinking those thoughts, this has become really popular, and it's become viewed as an element of best practice to make your data after you've published it oftentimes. But there are some ways we can discuss if we have time of even publishing your data safely and not quite releasing it, but having a digital object identifier set aside for your data set so that when you publish it, you could share and make open the data. Why would you do this? Well, the ideas that people have are that it's best practice because let's say that you publish a data set on an important finding, an important innovation in animal ethical care on farms. Well, in the interest of transparency and reproducibility, what is reproducibility? Well, reproducibility is that you analyze your data, you turn it into information, and you make a claim based on that information. Well, an element of reproducibility is if some other person independently analyzed your important data, would they come up with the same exact result? The surprising answer is they often may not, because they may make even slightly different subjective decisions than you have made in the process of analyzing the data. One field this is real big in is, I'd say two fields. They're both related to human health. One is in psychology, where reproducible analyses in the form of analyzing a data set that has already been analyzed and published is increasingly important to validate results independently. And also in human clinical medical trials for all sorts of ailments. It's a very broad literature. Transparency is another thing. You've found an important result. You have turned it into information and released it into the wild in the form of a peer-reviewed paper. But because the data are closed, if the data are closed, then any decisions you made about the analysis itself, about cleaning the data, about possibly excluding outliers, that's not transparent. And in the spirit of transparency, to validate the results, releasing your data publicly, often pairing it with a peer-reviewed article, has become, as I said, an element of best practice. Another reason to do it that's, let me say before I go on, that a lot of scientists, I hope some of you are thinking, especially if you've already started to analyze your own data, or possibly you have already published a paper or several papers, you might think the idea of someone looking over your shoulder and scrutinizing your analysis in a lot of detail, especially since the people that do this kind of thing might be formally trained as statisticians or otherwise extremely numerate and pay close attention to detail, you might not want that level of scrutiny. And, you know, a lot of people are not comfortable when they are first confronted with this idea with that kind of scrutiny. There are a couple of things I would say. One is that uh, some of the scrutiny is to to probe subjective decisions that are valid. Nobody's trying to catch somebody out in the spirit of transparency. So that's one thing. Two, if there is an error or if there is something that other people disagree with, it's best actually to so it's best for your career that other people are looking at your data. One, they're interested enough to be looking. That's one thing. Two, everybody makes mistakes, and the whole practice of science, the practice of science is based on getting it wrong sometimes and then changing your direction. So it's a positive thing, even though it feels possibly scary. An immediate benefit to releasing your data set is you have you turn one published paper into 2 lines on your CV instantly if you publish one paper from one data set and also publish the data set. And the impact that that can have, one, you would always cite yourself, your own data with your own paper. You have to publish the data with a document object, digital object identifier before you publish the paper. But because you can control whether or not the data set is downloadable, even though you publish it with a DOI, a digital object identifier, you choose when the data are released, and very few people would choose for the data to be downloadable before the published paper, the peer-reviewed paper comes out. So this amplifies your impact as a researcher. Someone gave me some advice of, as I look back on my career, the wisest mentor I ever had, it was a guy called Alan Moore. He used to be a professor at the University of Manchester. Now he's a professor at the University of Georgia, probably thinking about retirement at this point. And he gave me some advice about how many lines you should have on your CV when you go to apply for a job, a lectureship. And he said somewhat disrespectfully that, not to me, but disrespectful to the process of getting a job as an academic. He said that the person who hires you will probably be a department head, and they will have absolutely no idea about how good your research is. But every single one of them will be able to count to 10 for your publications. Now, that turned out to be pretty true in my career, that we're talking about metrics today. Just earlier today, I had my own professional development review, my own PDR here at Harper Adams, and the one of the phrases that was uttered was your KPIs, your key performance indicators, your KPIs are great. You know, let's talk about the next step in your career. And what he was talking about was the number of papers. Every single person can count those papers. And for your first job, they're counting to 10. So publishing your data will help you bolster your impact, your KPIs, if you have to use that kind of language. But it's just a truism that we live with. Finally, the most positive thing in this list is that if you publish your data, your ability to collaborate and recycle the effort you put into collecting that data set, even if it is a modest one, will be amplified. And if you make this a practice that you use in your career, more and more people will have the chance to reuse this. And I'll talk about a few ways that people collaboration and reuse may happen. But one way that it may happen is that your data set, if you release it, the actual data can be used in meta-analysis. The actual data could be used by someone else in your lab, someone you haven't met, someone that's not in your lab yet, who was a academic sibling of yours, perhaps your supervisor's next PhD student or next master's student. They could use your data to derive an effect size for their next experiment if they're working on something similar, which there probably will be a next person working on something similar. And so the creation of effect sizes, that person may use your data to, and maybe you will publish with your data an effect size. I'd encourage everybody to do that. So they would cite your paper in their first paper for deriving the effect size for their experimental design. This is the most positive, most professional way to leverage your own data through publication. So another way to evaluate whether people are actually publishing their data is to ask where they might publish their data. So if you're doing stuff on GitHub these days, and a lot of journals do this these days too, they use a service called Zenodo. What is Zenodo? Well, Zenodo is a service that generates digital object identifiers, so-called DOIs. And Zenodo is an early adopter of this in that they just get my tablet out here. Feel inspired to make some scribbles on here. Zenodo, ooh, that's large. Let's change that a little bit. There we go. Let's change that to red. There we go. Now everybody's happy. Zenodo integrates GitHub functionality, so you can. This is an option to publish your own data sets. If you're fluent and really good at using GitHub, you can set up Zenodo to iterate a digital object identifier for a data set that you self-publish on GitHub. Now, this is a system that probably a few people in this world do use for self-publishing their data. That's not the best route, and I'll unpack the reasons why as we talk here today. But one reason why is that that if you self-publish, you don't benefit from a data repository advertising your data of themselves. You know, it would be all up to you to advertise your data. Yet this is an option. This option of Zenodo, it's also very popular because a lot of journals these days encourage you to publish your data along with a published paper, and they would use Zenodo themselves as a service to generate that digital object identifier. Another one that's real popular, it's popular at universities, is Figshare. It's a commercial service. It's used by a lot of universities in their green route to publication and publishing data sets. It provides a DOI. It goes a little bit further, and it provides like a minimal dashboard with data previews and, you know, some basic analytics. This is a paid service, so you have to pay for this. Zenodo is, let me put a little red star, should be a gold star because it's free and it's open. Figshare is not free and it's closed. Data Dryad is another one I decided to highlight. There are others besides these ones I'm highlighting. These are just popular ones that I've used personally and that I know about. Data Dryad is, I think it was founded by the Joint Ecological Societies, and it's aimed towards researchers in the natural sciences and the biological sciences, I would say. And it often is used to generate a digital object identifier for data that have already been used in publications. Although it is journal integrated for some ecological journals, it also is a paid service. The payments that you make go to maintaining the database itself, and they also go to, for both Data Dryad and for Figshare, there is some editorial service. It's usually minimal, so you don't get any support before you make a submission. Instead, there is online guidance for preparing your data set. This usually involves including metadata with it, which I'll come on to what that is and the extent that you should go to for best practice. And a little bit of information that's required, minimal information that's required about who has generated the data, what the rights are for using the data and so forth. Anyway, most of the stuff you pay for these services comes for editorial scrutiny after you submit it. And even if you fancy yourself to be pretty good at best practice for data, to be honest, I think that I know a lot about it and I'm pretty good at it. I still get feedback from the editorial service for Dryad the few times that I publish data sets on Dryad. And it's usually stuff like, oh, yeah, I forgot about that. I should have done that. Or, oh, that's an error. Thanks for catching that. So it's usually positive in my view, but it can be irritating if you think of things like that as irritating. And then the one I'm going to talk most about today is one called the Dataverse project. This is purely open source. It's created in the spirit of we created this tool. We hope it's really useful. We hope it makes humanity better. And we've released every aspect of the tool we created for you to use as you see fit. And if you want to use the tool that we created as we see fit, you're welcome to do that too. So the Dataverse is a catch-all project. I've put the mascot for Harvard University here as well, because the most famous implementation of the Dataverse project is the Harvard Dataverse. So I'll come back to that. Come back to that eventually. But before I come back to the Harvard Dataverse, I wanted to run this idea past you and maybe even take a little survey in the chat and ask if anybody's heard of FAIR data, capital F-A-I-R. It's an acronym which stands for findable, reusable, accessible, and interoperable, not in that order. Who has heard of this principle? Just put a 1 in the chat if you've heard of FAIR data before and a 0 if you've never heard of it before. I know Megan has heard of it because if I'm not mistaken, Megan created this image that I'm showing you right now. So thank you for that, Megan. Few people have heard of it. Okay, interesting. That's good. Okay, some people have sort of heard of it, 1/3. Okay, it's quite a mix. Oh, possibly I did. Okay. I know we debated and talked about it. Okay, interesting. Some people have and some people haven't. Okay, that's fine. Well, I've put a link down here, which you can get to by either following the Canva link, or I've got a traditional output of a PowerPoint. So you can follow the link to read a little bit about it if you want an academic treatment of the FAIR principles for scientific data. Okay, so I'm just going to give you a little brief overview of it here today. So some of these are more obvious than others. The findable part is that the data should be easy to discover through having metadata and persistent identifiers. What does that mean? Well, the persistent identifier part means that there should be a link online and an identifier in the way of like a title could be an identifier that never changes, that's available for posterity. These days, in the days of the web and downloadable stuff, we have this concept of a digital object identifier that identifies a URL on a website somewhere where you make a promise that data is going to be there, that paper is going to be there, that piece of software is going to be there for the foreseeable future. I hesitate to say forever, because we never know what the next instance of the AI-fueled internet is going to be like. But the idea is that it's there forever, that it's persistent. That means that it should be there forever. That's the persistent part. We handle that through a digital object identifier, a DOI. But what about the metadata? Well, the metadata is, the way that I would describe this is that there's information about how the data were collected, where the data came from, if there's an experimental design, where that happened, geo-specific information about where the data were collected, if there's a spatial element, that sort of thing. If they were done at a university, what was the university? What's the name of the research group? and what's your name? Who collected the data? All of that would be considered metadata. There are other things that would be appropriate for metadata as well. Accessible. Well, the data should be retrievable. It could be programmatic. There could be a download link. It should be in a format that is common that people can make use of. Things like CSVs, things like Excel, Microsoft Excel format, XLSX or XLS. Some people are surprised. A few times people have expressed surprise, even grown-up scientists, that I myself advised the use of Excel. Why would you do that? It's a proprietary format from a large corporation, Microsoft. And that was true at one time, that it was a proprietary file format from a big corporation. But a few years, and I'd say recently for the last 10 years, there's been a trend for that big evil mega corporation Microsoft to do something surprising. They've made a lot of the standards they use for digital information open, completely open. And Microsoft Excel is one of those. It's an open standard that is a global standard. You don't even need a copy of Microsoft Excel to read Microsoft Excel because of that. You can translate it and convert it from and to other file formats very easily for free. And there are alternative open source pieces of software that are specialized in spreadsheets. So that's what is meant by accessible. And I've also covered some of what is meant by interoperable, that the format used for the data in terms of the file, but also the way the data are stored in the file, and the vocabulary is used to describe the data and the way the data are stored, allow integration with other data sets. What does that mean? That means that one example of what it means is that if you have geospatial data, you include latitude and longitudinal coordinates. If you're treating an experiment to FAIR principles, you use language like describing a factor in your experiment. Maybe it would be something like fertilization levels, or a treatment where there's something that is meant to enhance biodiversity versus a control. You refer to them as factors. And if you're controlling for spatial sampling with a blocking factor, you refer to that as a blocking factor. So using standard language that so that the data can be analyzed in a sensible way. And finally, the data should be reusable. This just means that the data should be well described. The best practice would be the data should be described in enough detail so that the exact same data could be collected in a replication experiment. That would be adequate in almost every case. And the other thing here is that it should be licensed in such a way to enable reuse. So to adhere to fair data principles, there is an explicit requirement that the licensing permits reuse for various contexts. What does that mean? Well, we can have many sessions like this discovering intellectual property licensing and copyright laws, but suffice it to say that it's kind of a technically important topic, and there's a massive amount to learn about it, to learn everything there is to know about licenses. But on the other hand, there are a few licenses that scientists tend to use. And one of the most common ones, there are many versions of this, but one of the commonest ones are that you're permitted to use the data as long as you give me credit for using it in some form. So CC BY, and all licenses that include CC BY. So most people would need advice to pick a license for their data. And some people, it's a common mistake to think that, actually, I want to donate my data for the betterment of humanity. I'm not going to put any license on my data. Well, this is actually one of the big misunderstandings about licensing for any intellectual property, including the papers that you write and any other thing that's worthwhile that you do in your life that might have copyright associated with it. If you don't put any license for somebody that was going to use it for something sensible, if they're risk averse, especially as opposed to a slightly anarchist scientist mentality. I'm not going to say who that might describe, but if they're risk averse in any way, if it's unlicensed, there would be a risk that the owner could come back and claim a license later that wasn't claimed. And then if you did use it, there'd be a risk that any works you built upon that used work in the absence of a license could be, at the worst, that you could be open to litigation because you've used them in a legally inappropriate way. So it's best to license them with an open license if you intend other people to actually use it. And in other words, an open license actually supports fair data principles. Otherwise, why bother? All right. So in essence, the idea here is to make your data easy to get at and positive and support knowledge creation, information creation by other people, but also by your future self and future collaborators you don't even know yet. That's the whole point here. Now let's talk about your specific data set. This is a slide, a version of which I've talked about a lot. There's data you have and data you wish you had. I always think about this. We always want to aspire to data that are like this. Your data set, we want it to be beautiful. We want it to be open and accessible. We want it to be, smart. We want it to be, open for business and positive and constructive. But the data we often collect, and I'm not pointing any fingers here. I myself have been involved in some very compromised exercises in data collection over the years, believe me. But the data we have are often compromised. They're often incomplete. They often are not the exact data we imagined. We often have time constraints when we're recording the data. We might start off with dirty, wet, field recorded sheets of data. One data set that Megan and I are working on now. I don't see any of the perpetrators in the chat. Let me just make sure of that real quick so I can make sure I can call someone out if I have a chance to. Nope, nobody's in the chat. It started off life as maps with handwritten circles that indicate bird species on them. And then, somebody had to take those maps, digitize them in some form and convert them to XY coordinates with metadata of bird species, transect, time, day, season, identity of the recorder, and so forth. Now that data set's a lot like this. Yes, the zoo data set. I'm glad you mentioned that, Helen. Thank you for reminding me of that data set. It is quite heterogeneous. We often have this problem. So how can we, no matter where our data starts with, how can we move towards this direction with any data set? Okay. Well, one, you can start to take on board the FAIR principles and use that as a set of guidelines. This applies to all research data. Some of the other data that Megan and I and others are working on is how to make the future farm and the long-term experiments data adhere to FAIR principles. We're a long way off from it, not for the least of which reason that some of the data is like the picture on the left. But it takes time to massage the data sets into a shareable format. Now, what we have here at Harper now is a data policy. And the data policy is new. You can access, and in fact, I'd like people to access it via the link here at the bottom and have a look at it. It's written at a very high level. It's written at a level for executives at the university and for to have relevance for legal people, for IT people, but it's aimed at scientific practice. So any scientists that have any feedback about it, maybe it's too high of a level, or maybe we need a companion document that just gets to the point for scientists. Feel free to have a look. What it does is it says, listen, if you're a researcher at Harper, we expect you to adhere to fair principles with your data collection. Now, some of you may be thinking, I haven't said this yet, so I want to say it now, and we can discuss this at the end if we have time, which we probably will, is that, well, what if I'm funded by industry? And what if my data is super valuable? Or what if my data is dangerous if it got out? Here I'm thinking of things like experiments that involve animals, and the general public, don't like that, some of them. So what if there's an element of that we can't be completely open with our data, at least not at the moment? Well, what the policy says is that you should at least consider fair principles for your data set. And it won't be possible for every single data set, but where you can and when you can, you're expected to adhere to them. And as I said, this applies to all research data, including undergraduates, master's students. But of course, research students will be one of the most important populations. Why is that? Because you guys are coming in and collecting the novel data sets. You guys are collecting data sets that are the most valuable for effect sizes. And often there's certainly no slight intended when I say things that I'm about to say in this particular way to research students. As I consider when you're a research student, it's the most exciting part of your whole career. Most of us dream about getting back that excitement for the rest of our career. Believe me, you're breaking new ground. You're collecting risky data, and in it is it's like every data set is a sample of gold ore, and there are gold nuggets in there. And if we're talking about calculating the effect size, even an imperfect, even a failed experiment has valuable effect size data that if you don't have it and you need it, I mean, you've got to get it. Yeah, I can put the link in the chat. Let me see how to do that in there we go. I can edit the link. I can get the link, copy the link, and then put it in the chat. There you go. You can download it directly from there. Anyway, I'm going to go on, but what I wanted to say was that this is relevant to all of us, and it's part of the policy. Well, part of this is that if we're going to encourage researchers to share their data, we need some secure storage for this here at Harper. And how are we going to accomplish that? See, this is the thing I don't like about Canva, that when I come out of my presentation, my settings go away. Well, it requires secure storage. And there's a thing I'm going to introduce to you called the Harper Adams Dataverse. It also requires digital object identifiers for citations and for access to that data from those collaborators you want to cultivate. The policy emphasizes the concept of tidy data. Now, if you haven't encountered this concept, we talked about it a lot in these meetings. We've done it in practical ways where we take a non-tidy data set and we convert it to a tidy data set. I've got a picture of one of the classic data sets I use for that in a second, if this is a new idea. But we want the data to be tidy, that explains the variables in the sampling. We want there to be strong metadata so that there's enough for reasonable reproducibility, and other accessory documentation. Like it's nice often to explain briefly as you can, what the motivation for collecting the data were. That's often sets the context for the metadata. That's very important. Likewise, the policy talks about roles for researchers, students, and other interesting people at the university. Now, Even though we have a data policy, it's new. And so essentially, I will reveal to you now that no one is adhering to the policy now. And the idea over the next few years is that we build a culture of adhering to the data policy. And has it been made official yet? Well, that's a good question. What does being made official mean? Has it been communicated by Don Arnold to the research center heads yet? No, but it will be probably before the end of the year. Um, but that doesn't stop anyone from giving some feedback on the living document and even publishing your data in the Harper Adams Dataverse. So that's what we're talking about here today. So what is tidy data? I've mentioned this a number of times. It's actually quite simple, but you'd be surprised at how often data are used to initialize analysis without being tidy. So I've got this citation down here. It's an open publication in the Journal of Statistical Software. Don't let the Journal of Statistical Software scare you off from this article, though. It's not only is it eminently readable and non-technical, it was written by a guy who in the last decade, Hadley Wickham is his name. Hadley Wickham was referred to as the first rock star of statistics. And this paper, I don't know how many citations it has, but it has thousands and thousands of citations. I won't go in. I'll spare you of my my pontification about what makes a good paper. But in short, if 50 people cite your paper, it's a good paper. If 100 people cite your paper, it's a really good paper. And if more than 100 people cite your paper, like if you have any papers, if you know any professors with more than 1,000 citations on any of their papers, it's a big deal. So when we get papers that are citation classics, that have thousands and thousands of citations, yeah, there's probably something to it, and we should pay attention to it. Anyway, Hadley Wickham's paper laid out this structure for tidy data, and it really has become the standard for best practice for all fields of scientific discovery that involve mostly small to medium-sized data sets. And when I say that as a data scientist, where a really big data set doesn't fit on your computer. So any data that you collect that can fit on your computer should be in tidy data format. All right. There should be a clear and consistent data structure for tidy data. It should be stored in a way that's logical, with columns and rows, columns being your variables and rows being your observations. It should be efficient to use and access. It should be reproducible. It should be available and in a format that enables automated data workflows. What the heck does that mean? If you don't use automated data workflows, I'm not going to go into a detailed explanation, but basically what it means is you should be able to download it and use it in an analysis instantly. I see that someone may have seen Hadley Wickham posting on maybe the old R forums. He was on there a lot, and on Stack Exchange, and it is a treat because usually he's answering them like a computer perfectly, and sometimes it appears that he's not very nice when he answers a silly question. But anyway, I love to see him on there too. Now, there should be documentation along with the variables. And some people, like myself, would refer to that as a data dictionary that describes what every variable is and includes some other details in there, like how the sampling was done, what the experimental design is, and so forth. This was a data set that I encountered some years ago. Student brought me this data set and they said, can you help me analyze the data? And they had made some graphs here. And this is not an egregious example of non-tidy data, but it is a good example of very common mistakes that are done. For one, you can't analyze this data in any programmatic way at all. You can make a few Excel graphs. There's some summary statistics over here. Amongst the no-nos for data, one of the biggest ones is that this column is a mixture of one factor, which is a species, and the treatment. So you could analyze this with a one-way ANOVA, considering all those categories, which is kind of what they did over here with two different graphs. But really, you want to analyze these two factors independent of one another. So that's one thing to fix. There's some nonsensical columns here, like this one. You'll notice that it's almost entirely invariant, so it contains no information that can be leveraged in any sort of analysis whatsoever. We have something here, peak area. Not really sure what peak area is. At least I wasn't when I first saw the data set. Something else that looks promising, that it's total concentration of something in nanograms. There's something slightly different than that also could be promising. That is individual concentration in nanograms. And then there's something that is, well, that's not the most helpful column, is it? Called peak area. And there's a sample ID over here, probably not that interesting, but nice to have for documentation. And then there's this row that goes along here that seems to be different than all of the other rows that doesn't belong in there. There are lots of other things I could point to, like the fact that there are weird spaces in the data set that just are problematic, that the names have weird characters and lots of spaces in them, the names of the variables, that is. There's embedded stuff with the data that can't be analyzed. So to curate this data, if we were going to convert this to Hadley-Wickham's tidy format, we'd want to do something like this. This is the actual same data set, but completely converted into tidy format. You can see down here it's got two tabs, one for data, one for the dictionary. The treatments have been separated. I retained the one variable that was almost entirely invariant, and then created a data dictionary that explains the factors in enough detail that anybody could read this and make sense of it. Oh yes, I know what these are now. Yeah, maybe other people need to learn about the joys of the gas chromatograph and peak area and how that relates to how much of a particular chemical are in some sample. But the point is that somebody would look at the data set in its first format, its non-tidy format, and it might not be apparent. And you might have to make some assumptions about it. And with a tidy format, you shouldn't have to make any assumptions about the data or where it came from or what the data contains. Okay. I'm going to shift gears here, and I'm going to just talk about the Dataverse and some practicalities about how to get started if you ever want to entertain or discuss the idea with your supervisor about publishing some data. Some of you probably have some data sets that are publishable now. In fact, I'm sure quite a lot of you, just glancing over the chat, do already have some data sets that are perfectly publishable right now. Even if you think, oh, it was a failed experiment, or oh, it's not a great experiment, I got to do another one. How can you publish your data? And so that's what I'm going to talk about for the last couple of slides. I mentioned the Dataverse project. This is kind of a big deal in the fair data principles world, right? This is you can go to the home page if you're interested in reading a little about it. It is kind of interesting because there's a little bit of a history. They tell you who they're basing this for. They're basing it for basically everybody. Just plain old researchers can use it. In fact, we'll see in a second that some individual researchers who generate a lot of data have their own Dataverse. That doesn't really make sense for most people who create data sets like people in the biosciences tend to do. It doesn't really make sense for you to have your own Dataverse, but for some fields it does. Some journals, these days it's not uncommon for journals to encourage you to include your data, and maybe even if you use R or Python, the code you use to produce your statistical analysis, that's encouraged with some journals these days, and some of those journals use their own version of the Dataverse because it's open source. The software for it can be downloaded and installed on a local server. And so some institutions, both companies, research institutes, and universities, they run their own version of the data source in that way by virtue of the data verse being open source. And then developers also use it to make some commercial projects and some non-commercial projects. So it's made for, really, it's a broad church, made for lots of different people for lots of different reasons. And the most famous implementation of the Dataverse project that I'm aware of is the Harvard Dataverse. I don't know how much you guys know about Harvard University. A lot of people would consider it the best university in the world. In fact, almost everyone would consider it to be the best university in the world, unless you happen to be at Cambridge or Oxford or St. Andrews, in which you think it might be the second best. But it usually, for many years, has been ranked as the best. It's a very small university. It actually is only about twice the size of Harper Adams, but it has attracted over the years the heaviest hitters of the research world in many, many disciplines. And it's known for having the very highest standards in the world by most measures in education for undergraduate students and in research for research students. And another thing you have to know about Harvard is that there may be something magical and special about Harvard. They would certainly have you believe that if you talk to anybody who got a degree from Harvard. But they're incredibly rich with a generous endowment that has grown. It's even grown by massive leaps over the past 100+ years that Harvard's been around. It was established by a guy who was named John Harvard. He humbly named the university after himself after donating a massive whack of cash to found the university. And with some of that money comes an ideal to give back to the research community and the world at large. And one of the ways that they've done that, one of the very many ways they've done that, is by establishing this free resource called the Harvard Dataverse. And a neat thing about it is that you can have a dataverse within a dataverse. So it's really a data multiverse. That's what I call it anyway. And if we look at the Dataverse homepage, we can see that it contains 8,171 dataverses, and that it contains 225,000 plus data sets and over almost 5 million files. And, there's some other categories here that you can read about. Well, one of that 8,171, guess what, is the Harper Adams Dataverse. So we have our own dataverse. It's early days. We don't have any dataverses that we host, and we only have 7 published data sets. You can go to the link if you want to and check it out to see an idea of it. But basically, this is it, and it has been designed to carry out the vision for the Harper Adams data policy, to make it easy, free, accessible, all the FAIR principles for anybody to grab data that is generated by the future farm, our long-term experiments, or our research experimental data sets that can be released, and also to contribute to it with the same ease for researchers. So the idea for this is that it adheres to the policy, that it documents data, effect size, et cetera, for all researchers. For supervisors who may be thinking, God, this is something that probably seems like it might take some time. I don't want my students wasting their time. But actually, the benefit that supervisors get, they're not going to get a big benefit off having another line for a data set on their CV or anything for their next big promotion or anything. What they will get is they'll have an instant citation to send their next research student who needs experimental design support. And hey, here's the data. Just look at the data. The effect size has already been calculated for you. Go and check it out. Of course, it provides the digital object identifier for you to cite yourself and for you to put on your CV. It does that for everybody. Because it's part of the data policy, this could even contribute to promotion internally at Harper and certainly at other places. Now, an aspect of the data policy is another policy, and it's the Harper Adams University Statistics and Data Science Consulting Service. Now, up until the past year, this grand sounding service has been really offered by a single person at this university, namely me. And there has been now investment in more people, and opportunistically, because I was away from the university for most of the last 12 months, other people have begun to contribute, and we should all thank them for the work that they've done and the diligence they've done in contributing to the service. But this will be formalized again in the coming months, this service. How will it change? It'll still be the same people. It'll still be the same statistical consulting and data science support. But in addition to that, we will support you to publish your data. We will help you with tidy data formatting and your metadata prep. We will help you calculate and communicate your effect sizes. We'll help with the DOI registration, and we'll also help you pick the right license that fits your situation for intellectual property. Everything from I want it as open as possible and immediate up to and including there are intellectual property issues with this, and we can't release the data. Maybe not ever. You can still publish a data set with the metadata declaring your data and the title of the data set. Now, there's a question, can data be published from Future Farm by people not connected with Future Farm? Well, that's a good question. I don't know if you're asking this, but are you asking whether you've maybe shared some data collected from Future Farm? Go on, you can ask the question if you want.
Just a
sorry.
second, because we sit next to each other.
Okay, there was a feedback, sorry.
Yeah.
My question refers, was the data from Future Farm is published on the Harvard Dataverse, can someone like myself get access to it? I presume it is accessible now, and simply make an analysis and publish it in a form of a peer-reviewed paper. So is it the idea behind publishing the data, or it is like a prerequisite that the owner of the data, which is the Future Farm, can only be an author of a future paper?
Oh, yeah. That's a great question. The short answer is it depends on the license. But if you adhere to the spirit of the FAIR principles, when you publish your data, if you make the data set open, you imply that I've already published all I want from this particular data set. And what somebody else would typically do, they typically wouldn't take the same data set and publish something different from it. That is technically possible if they publish something different and they can find a peer-reviewed journal and they have something new to say. If they're saying the same thing, it's not ethical and it doesn't fit peer review, and they'll probably be caught and called out. But what a more typical situation would be is I want to publish a meta-analysis of milk production, and I want to do it for lots of different farms. And here I found a published data set from a dairy here in England at some place called Harper Adams that I've never heard of. Oh, and here I've got a data set from Nigeria. Oh, and here I've got 2 data sets from Italy, and they combine it to make something new. Or else maybe they do a traditional meta-analysis. Maybe they only want to get the coefficients of variation and effect sizes out of this data set, and they calculate them themselves. This is notoriously hard to do in meta-analysis papers. I'm looking at Iona. I know you know that, and other people that have tried to do that. So typically they wouldn't just republish your data. Typically they would add something new to it and combine it with other data. But that is a good question. Let's see. So I see people leaving. So I want to get to the very last slide, and I'm almost to it. And so I wanted to say that pretty soon we'll have a new a portal for the service, but you know who we are. Contact us anytime you want to discuss things. I'm sort of finally feeling like I'm back to work and getting in the flow. Few people have contacted me, and I think I've answered everybody now, but if I haven't, just send me another email. It will be welcome to see an email to remind me to answer you. But feel free if you want to chat about publishing your data. That's why we're here, and it's part of the new policy. And that's all I've got. And that was right to the minute.